I remember a period when the Nordics was a real entity. That has, to some extent, been lost.
Today I'm very pleased to say welcome Jan Egeland. It's a privilege to have you with us. And Time magazine already in 2006 named you as one of the 100 people shaping our world. And you're a very seasoned diplomat with a long record in humanitarian efforts, and not at least in your position as the United Nations Secretary General for Humanitarian Affairs. And today you're heading the Norwegian Refugee Council here in Oslo. And with Sweden joining NATO as we speak, I'm curious, Norway seems to have been navigating this balance nicely. What are in your view, the reasons for this success?
I think the reason that there has been a Norwegian activism for peace, for human rights, for humanitarian principles, is that there was a lot of cooperation between the Norwegian foreign policy establishment and activist organizations, non-governmental organizations, etc. It's a myth that membership in the in the European Union or in NATO restrains a country. It could take attention away from the minister that has to go to Brussels all the time, and start to be absorbed by all of these meetings or all of this bureaucracy. But if there is an interest in trying to do good in Gaza, in Sudan, in Colombia, in Myanmar, etc., there is nothing restraining a country from doing that but its own priorities. So I would say Sweden, Finland coming into NATO would not hold them back in any way, nor would Norway have been held back if we had joined the European Union, which we didn't.
Yeah, that's also very true. And in your view, looking at Sweden now, what role could Sweden ideally assume as a NATO member?
I think this is all good for the NATO alliance to have two strong democratic nations with a strong civil society, a strong orientation towards human rights, enter NATO. I must say, I tweeted at the time that I felt badly as one of the original NATO countries that it seemed like Sweden had to lower their standard in terms of asylum seekers and refugee protection and so on to join NATO. So I tweeted, thinking of my old friend Jens Stoltenberg and so on, if we're not there to defend human rights and asylum rights and so on, what's the point of NATO? I think it will not lower Sweden's standards, which have through the last generation been excellent in providing asylum to those seeking protection. Actually, Sweden has been less active of late than it was for long. All in all, it's up to the country itself to either defend international principles and ideals or lower their standards. It's not the alliances that decide that.
That's encouraging to hear. And do you think, as the Nordic countries alliance or the brand of the Nordic countries, how strong is that in this context? Is that an opportunity in itself?
Well, I'm an old man in international relations. I remember a period when the Nordics was a real entity. That has, to some extent, been lost. Perhaps in a way because some countries were in NATO, some countries were in the European Union, and others were not. The attention went towards Brussels and Washington and so on, and not to have this Nordic identity. In the old days, when I was the Deputy Foreign Minister of Norway in the 1990s, we had a lot of Nordic initiatives. Why don't we have the 5 Nordic UN ambassadors going to the Secretary General? Why don't the 5 go to the big powers? Why don't you have a common position and declaration about a big and burning international issues? Since we're like-minded, we have a good image internationally. Scandinavia is if they've heard of us, it's generally with positive connotations. I think it's a major mistake that the Nordic countries have not nurtured this Nordic initiatives. Norway alone, Denmark alone, Sweden alone, Finland alone is less powerful than a united Nordic group. United Nordic group would be the second largest donor in the world, for example. It has some of the best non-governmental organizations in the world. It has among the largest footprints in international relations. The Nordic countries should be more of an activist together.
That's a really good outlook going forward. And what would be your advice to Sweden then in this situation?
Well, that Sweden remains Sweden and hopefully becomes more internationally activist than Sweden is even today. I think there's been more of a sort of an introversion in many countries. We've seen that with Denmark. We've seen it to some extent with Sweden. We've seen it for quite some time with Finland. I've been happy to see Norway again of late, for example, in the Gaza context, playing a role, being a leader, being cited on all sorts of issues. It's good for the country. It's good for our self-esteem. It's good for our image. We get more, we're listened to more. What Sweden should not do is like Norway has at times done, wake up every morning and think, what is Washington wanting us to do today? What would be their advice? Be an independent actor for good in the world. That's how a country has self-respect and self-esteem.
And do you remain hopeful looking at all the challenges, not at least which we are seeing right now in the world?
Well, I'm always hopeful, but I must confess I'm less of an optimist now than I would be 5 or even 6 years ago. The international relations has gone down in the deep freezer. It's too often the West against the rest. The West has fallen down on the wrong side to a large extent in the Gaza context. The rest of the world is asking, how come occupation seems to be okay if Israel does it, but if Russia does it, it's really, really, really bad. And you have Putin basically attacking his neighbors indiscriminately. You have the rivalry between the U.S. and China, which is not good for neither economic development nor climate change. I'm a bit pessimistic, but we remain hopeful, and we, as civil society, would remain fighting, and we will put things on the agenda, and we are also many.
So thanks. We hope for strong Nordic voices then as part of NATO. And thank you, Jan, for talking to us today.
Thank you.